The world was silent, except for the sound of flies. When Hugh Glass opened his eyes, he saw nothing but the dirt and sky. He could barely speak. A bear had torn his throat open. His leg was broken, and his ribs completely shattered. His back was flayed so deeply, his spine was nearly visible. He was half covered in leaves and dirt, his wounds exposed to the unclean ground around him. In this condition, he was left for dead, half buried, but for him, he would refuse to die. He desperately searched around for his rifle, his bag, and his knife. But anything that he would need to survive was gone. And the men that he had trusted, well, they were gone too. Out of a pure instinct to survive, Hugh started to crawl. He didn't know what was driving him, but he knew that if he stopped, he would die right here. He was alone, unarmed, and literally half-eaten. But this wasn't enough to stop him. Not when the bleeding got worse, not when the cold set into his bones, not even when crawling felt like dying 1 inch at a time. Somehow, against all odds, he was determined to survive everything nature was about to throw at him. How anyone could survive this impossible situation boggles my mind, and well, it's a question that I'm going to try and answer with you today. So stick around. Hugh Glass was born in 1783 in Pennsylvania to Scottish and Irish parents. As a young man, he worked the rivers and coastlines as a fisherman, eventually signing on as a sailor aboard a merchant vessel trading in the Gulf of Mexico. And in 1816, as a young man, when he was near Galveston Bay, his ship was taken by pirates. They were part of Jean Lafayette's flotilla. At the time, Lafayette had turned Galveston Island into a stronghold that he used for raiding Spanish ships and running contraband along the Gulf Coast. When they boarded his ship, Glass was given a choice: join them or die. So, he joined. But his plan certainly wasn't to stay, and sometime in the following year, he escaped by literally leaping from the ship while under fire and swimming for the Texas shoreline. Somehow he made it to land, but at the time, the coast offered no safety. He was deep in the Kiowa territory, surrounded by salt marsh, mosquitoes, and alligators. There were no roads, no settlements, nothing but swamp, grassland, and heat. He had no rifle and he had no boots. All he could do was limp forward barefoot and bleeding. At the time, he scavenged anything he could find: roots, bird eggs, and the occasional sea mussel. He drank from muddy water holes, enough to make him sick at times, and at night, he dug into the earth to stay warm. His journey literally stretched across Texas and into the edge of what is now called the Great Plains. Eventually, he crossed into the scary Pawnee territory, near the Lute and Platte rivers. It's here that he ends up being taken captive again. But this time, something changed. The Pawnee didn't kill him. In fact, they helped nurse him back to health, and over time, they ended up accepting them as one of their own into their camp. With them, he learned to hunt bison and antelope. He learned how to survive with a bow, a knife, and literally no other backup. He ended up living with these people for several years, and in 1821, he ends up traveling with the Pawnee diplomatic delegation to St. Louis. And when he arrives here, he was sun-worn and trail-hardened, and completely fluent in the wilderness. It's said that he didn't talk much, and he didn't really stand out, but the men around him noticed that he was seasoned, silent, and definitely durable. And by the next year, a man named General William Ashley began recruiting men for a trapping expedition up the Missouri River. At this point, after surviving a long trek through the wilderness, surviving a pirate ship, Hugh Glass doesn't really know where to call home, and he decides to join the trapping expedition. He didn't do it for adventure. He didn't do it for riches. He did it because, for him, moving west seemed to be the only direction that felt right. The frontier at the time seriously was no myth. It was rough out there. The expedition's plan was to push up the Missouri River and cross overland to the Yellowstone, and trap beaver deep into what's now Montana and Wyoming. It would be a 1,000-mile journey into unmapped territory through territories of the Sioux, Arikara, and the Blackfeet, a place where nobody could rescue them, and nobody would probably know where they even were. Throughout the journey, they faced constant threats, not just ambushes from unfriendly indigenous, but starvation, hypothermia, and infections that could turn a blister into a death sentence. There were no supply lines, and if you ran out of powder or meat at this time, you literally would just starve to death if you couldn't find sustenance in the wilderness. And that summer, near the Arikara villages, the expedition ended up being attacked. Glass took a musket ball in the thigh during a pre-dawn firefight, but somehow he bound the wound and kept moving. Like I said in the start, this guy refuses to die at every part of this story. And by the time they reached the forks of the Grand River, they were ragged, low on food, and completely worn thin. But this is when the company and the expedition decide that they needed a scout to be sent ahead so that the group didn't run into trouble again. The scout would move ahead alone, they would hunt game ahead of the rest of the group and find a safe path to travel forward. And Glass didn't hesitate to step up for this role. He shouldered his rifle, packed his flint, and stepped into the trees. He seemed to think he knew what the wilderness could throw at him, but as always in these stories, Mother Nature always has something up her sleeves. For 3 days, Hugh Glass moved alone through the river breaks, scouting ahead of the party. The terrain was steep and the grass was knee-high and wet with morning dew. He wore moccasins to stay quiet, and from the journey, they were starting to split, so at times his feet were even bleeding. He's doing all this while his thigh is still healing from the musket ball weeks earlier. It's certainly fair to say, at this point, this guy is used to discomfort. He moved quick and he slept light. He kept his powder horn wrapped in hide just to keep it dry, and he made sure he never lit a fire at night so his location was always concealed. After 3 days of travel, the trees started to thin out into low brush and cut banks. He discovered elk tracks which crisscrossed in the mud, and he started to spot fresh droppings near a narrow bend in the creek. It looked like a promising place to hunt. It would give him a chance to gather meat and hides for the rest of the crew that would arrive there within the next few days. He moved carefully through the undergrowth, watching the tree line for any movement. Then he heard it. It was a sharp snap of branches up ahead. It was heavy and deliberate. He crouched low and listened. Another sound crunching through the bush. There was more than one animal. He knew whatever it was big, but it certainly wasn't fast and it was taking his time. He figured it was an elk, maybe a bull pushing through the willows, and he gripped his rifle and kept moving forward. And that's when he heard one more snap and the willows literally exploded. And it wasn't an elk because a grizzly burst from the trees. It was a full-grown sow, easily 800 pounds, moving like a boulder falling down a cliff. This wasn't a bluff charge. This wasn't a predatory charge. He could tell right away, because when bears are predatory, you don't hear them coming. She was charging in defense because she wasn't alone. She had 2 cubs behind her. Glass knew this was the worst situation that he could find himself in. A grizzly sow defending its cubs, and she would do whatever it was to keep them safe. Glass didn't have any time to aim, and he didn't have any time to think. By the time he turned around to try and raise his rifle, the first swipe from the bear completely knocked the gun out of his hands, and the second slammed him onto his back. She tore through him. Her claws literally shredded his back, exposing muscle and spine. Her teeth clamped down on his leg, and he could hear his own bones being crushed. She raked his scalp open, and somehow he managed to stab her with his knife once or twice, but it certainly wasn't enough to stop her. He knew that if he could lay still, she might stop her attack. But somehow, by the grace of God, the rest of the expedition just happened to show up, as he's laying on the ground literally being mauled. Together, the rest of the crew were able to shoot the bear and kill it. This was over in seconds, but for Hugh, the damage was done. By the time the expedition reached him, he was still breathing, but barely. His throat had been ripped open, his leg was broken, he had lost a ton of blood, and his ribs were completely shattered. It literally looked like his back had been peeled open. They had no stretcher, no horses, and really no option to get him medical help. At this point, the expedition was behind schedule, low on food, and deep in hostile territory. They could have waited around for him, but there was money to be made, and the expedition decided the best thing they could do was leave him behind. In all likelihood, they were certain that this guy was going to die from his wounds, and moving him realistically probably wasn't an option with that amount of broken bone. What they decided to do was carry on with the expedition, but they would leave 2 men behind. A man named John Fitzgerald and a teenager named Jim Bridger. They were paid to stay with Glass until the end. Not to save him, but to sit with him until he eventually died, to keep him company, and eventually make his grave. But days would pass, and Glass refused to die. He laid there, broken, silent, and just staring into the wilderness. His breathing was ragged, but steady. His eyes were always tracking the 2 men, reminding him that he was still there and alive. But for the two men, Bridger and Fitzgerald, that was the problem. They had no plans to stay here for an extended period of time, so they made a decision. They took Glass's rifle, his knife, and his tools, basically anything he could have used to survive, and packed it in their gear. They dug a shallow grave and literally buried him alive in it. They figured there was no chance that this guy was surviving, so they simply turned their backs and walked away with the intention of telling the rest of the expedition he was already dead. As the two men disappeared into the forest, Hugh Glass lost consciousness, and when he finally awoke, he woke to nothing but the sound of flies. He couldn't even open his mouth. Like I mentioned, his throat and stuff had been torn by the bear, and breathing was barely possible. His ribs that had been broken so badly by the bear, he could actually feel shifting every time he tried to take in a breath. His leg that was broken actually was useless, because the joint had become so swollen and infected, he could barely move it. His body wasn't just injured. Between the loss of blood and the infection setting in, it was barely functioning. He laid in agony and confusion for a while, and slowly he began to move his head and start to take stock of the scene and what exactly had happened. He turned his head slowly and saw nothing familiar. There was no fire anymore, no pack, there was no rifle, and no more men standing guard. He listened for voices but heard none. He looked around desperately to find his knife, but it was gone. This is when he realized the two men that were guarding him took everything that he needed to survive and bailed on him. They didn't just abandon this guy, they literally took any chance of his survival away from him. But this betrayal lit something inside of Hugh. It was a rage that fueled his desire to survive, an anger that he could use to drive himself forward so that he could confront the men who did this to him. I want to thank you guys for joining in today. And hearing this story definitely makes me think if I was stuck in the woods, I'm not choosing the bear. If you want to hear more historical survival and mysteries, consider subscribing to the channel. I won't waste any more of your time, so let's move on. What came first wasn't even a thought or a fear. It was just an acknowledgement that the only way he would get out of this is by moving his body. It started first with moving one finger at a time, and then slowly shifting his shoulder, and eventually dragging his arm slowly across the ground. He did this one limb at a time until slowly he built up the strength to crawl. He had no plan, no direction, just an instinctive refusal to die in that hole. He used his elbows and his forearms, dragging his weight forward while his broken leg trailed behind him. But here he was, moving forward, though slowly, breath by breath and inch by inch. The wound in his back had actually begun to develop gangrene. There was black around the edges, and maggots had begun to spread throughout the exposed flesh. He could feel them moving beneath his torn skin, but he knew that they were eating the dead tissue, and they might literally be the only thing keeping the infection from getting worse. Eventually, he was able to drag himself close to a tree and use a branch to splint his leg with strips torn from his shirt. It wasn't enough to walk properly, but it was enough to at least keep the limb stable and the broken bones from shifting around. Because at that time, the pain was so unbearable, when some of the bones would shift in his body, it literally knocked him unconscious each time. At this point, he had no map in his head and no real clear picture where he would go, but he knew that lying still would kill him. Whether it was the hypothermia that got him, or eventually another animal, all he knew was that he better get on the move. The first few hours were absolutely unbearable, and not that it really got easier from here, but at least he knew how to move his body. He would crawl when he could and rest when he couldn't. He pulled his body forward over rocks, grass, and uneven earth, just telling him to put one hand in front of the other and don't stop. The first days of the crawl, he didn't make a lot of progress. He had no blanket or no fire, so the temperature was a constant threat to him. As he was crawling along, he found animal tracks and literally dug depressions in them so that the water would seep up from below and puddle in the tracks. He ended up drinking this muddy water full of insects that does end up making him quite sick, but it still kept him just alive enough he didn't die. Not having food, all he could really do was chew what grass he found and stuff he found on the ground. He was able to find some wild onions and prairie turnips, but it was just enough to keep death away from him. At one point, he was actually able to catch a frog near a stream bed, and he literally ate it raw. The maggots crawling around his skin and on his back eating the infection that was spreading were a reminder of what had happened a few days ago. But he kept moving forward, and slowly his body was starting to heal a little bit at a time. When he would move too fast or push it too far, he would start bleeding again, and he would have to use strips of cloth from his shirt to cover those wounds. But he had to find just the right pace that was enough to keep him alive, but not so fast that it would cause him to bleed and end up killing him. After a while, he was able to move at a rate of about a mile a day, and the land that he crawled through was often uneven and had a lot of scrubs and brushes that if he wasn't careful, he would just get re-injured. So he had to really, really take his time. By the 5th day, he already lost track of time. He was able to reach a rise and he saw a river in the distance. It wasn't wide, but it was moving. He knew it meant water. He was dangerously dehydrated at this point. Drinking from puddles that caused him to vomit just wasn't doing it for him. Though sometimes that water might actually hydrate him a bit. If it's causing you to be sick, you might just be getting more dehydrated than hydrated. And that happens to a lot of people in the wilderness. It's not just from the classic beaver fever or giardia that people get from drinking unclean water. Like any kind of illness can really do that to you out there. But after hearing that creek, it literally took him almost another day to reach it. And by the time he got there, he literally collapsed on the bank and he drank until he threw up. And then he did it again. For him, the water was cold and refreshing, but it was letting him know he was alive. It was enough to bring him back from the edge. He was able to pull driftwood from the edges of the creek and lash it together with some rawhide that had been taken from the bear and slung it around him. It wasn't a raft, but it was enough to make him float. So he laid across this kind of rawhide and tied up wood bundle and just let himself float down the creek, figuring the current is going to carry him any place better than this. The cold water helped bring the swelling down in his joints and broken bones. At night, he would crawl ashore and try and look for shelter. He was able to make a small fire with what he could find around him with some wet wood and broken rocks, but he also knew this was a danger of giving away his location. And that's exactly what happened, because one morning, he awoke to voices. It was a small group of indigenous men he thought were possibly Lakota or Mandan. And they stood over him, almost looking at him with pity. They didn't draw any weapons, they didn't look surprised, and one of them actually handed him a piece of dried meat. Another one of them helped adjust a splint in his leg and tend to his wounds. They didn't stay long, they said little, and Hugh, he said nothing at all, because he literally couldn't. But from what he remembered, this small group of men literally left him a lot better than when they found him. Now, this is important to note, is that indigenous people at this time aren't a monolith. There's like a lot of individual and separate groups or nations, and some at the time were hostile towards the group of trappers in this area, and some weren't. And some were hostile towards each other, and others weren't. So it was all kind of a gamble who you ran across to, whether or not you were going to have a problem. But this little bit of help from these guys was enough to give Hugh the energy he needed to keep dragging himself forward. He was able to use the trees to lean against and start getting himself upright, and even took some sticks to kind of make a makeshift crutch. Each day, he would take a few more steps than the last. He'd fall often and have to crawl again, but he was making progress. The hunger that was with him never left. The pain was always there, and if anything, it was probably keeping him alive. Up to this point, it was his instinct to survive and the rage that he had for Fitzgerald and Bridger that drove him to move forward. But slowly, that fire inside him started to become distant. He didn't have time or energy left for fury. He just simply didn't have the energy to carry forward these thoughts of vengeance with him constantly. Though, because anytime things popped into his head, it was just consumed by the pain in his body. And moment by moment, his survival was unfolding in front of him, with whether it was finding the next patch of shade to get a break from the heat, the next trickle of water, or just planning how to make the next move forward over the hazardous terrain. Because the landscape sure didn't change. It just was dangerous everywhere he went. In the areas where the prairie was wide and open, hawks and vultures would circle above. Coyotes would follow his trail. All of the wildlife in the area was literally waiting for him to expire and hoping he would turn into carrion. But he was determined not to let that happen. As he was able to walk more and more, he started to cover more distance. But still, he found no sign of any camps or settlements, nothing that could give him medical help or any type of rescue. But he still just kept moving forward, and eventually the prairie would give way to broken hills. He finally found trees again. At least he knew fire and shelter was going to be a little bit easier. He didn't recognize the area he was in, but he found a large river, which is wider and slower. And he knew that if he followed this, eventually it was going to take him somewhere. One evening, a storm rolled in that was so bad, he had to literally crawl under an uprooted tree and lay there shivering until it passed. And when the sky finally cleared, he got the energy to stand up and start walking again. And it was about the 12th day when he heard dogs in the distance. At first, he thought it was a dream or a hallucination, but the barking didn't fade. And slowly, with the barking came the smell of wood smoke and cooked meat, and then voices. He froze and stared into the trees, looking for any movement or any sign of a settlement. He didn't know if this was even real at this point, and he pushed forward desperately. Despite stumbling and tripping over the bushes with no care to more injuries, he sees a wall of sharpened logs, and up above it was a flag fluttering at the gate. It was Fort Kiowa. He had never been to this place, but he knew about it. And he didn't walk through the gates like a man returning from a long hunt. He literally staggered half dead, his limbs swollen, his back wide open and infected. He was nearly skeletal, and his skin so sun-darkened and wind-chapped that it looked like he was peeling. And his beard was matted. He could breathe, but he couldn't talk. The guards had no idea who this guy was at first, and one of the men actually reached for his rifle, unsure of what was approaching them. But as he crept closer, one of the other guards stopped the other guy from shooting him because this guy was simply no threat in his condition. They recognized that he was probably a fur trapper, just based on his outfit, and what they did was bring him inside and put him immediately onto a medical cot. They called for the surgeon, and he arrived later that day, and if he hadn't, it said that Glass wouldn't have made it, because his wounds were beginning to really turn into a condition that was going to be irreversible. Even though the maggots had slowed it down, this guy really needed medical attention. The tissue in his back was mottled and hot from the infection. His leg was nothing but a mass of bruised flesh wrapped in his homemade splint. And literally from top to bottom, this guy was in terrible shape. It said that he literally had no fat left on his body from this journey. He had been running on nothing but his own instinct to survive because he had no fuel in that literal walking corpse he had. So the men at Fort Kiowa did what they could. They cleaned the wounds with alcohol, they cut away any dead skin, they packed his back with clean cloth and ash, and he drifted in and out of sleep for days. He barely spoke, he still couldn't speak. The men were able to spoon feed him broth, and they kept somebody posted with him 24/7, just so that they could keep him from dying, or at least make sure he didn't die alone. They were still unsure at this point whether they were nursing a man back to health or just delaying his inevitable death. But as always, Glass wouldn't die. He clawed his way back inch by inch, not to strength, but to motion. He was able to finally sit upright and eventually stand, even though he was trembling at first, but he was determined to get his strength back. And when he could finally talk again, he whispered one question. Where were Bridger and Fitzgerald? But he was told that this time, weeks had passed, and their trapping company had moved on, but Bridger, he was still nearby, stationed just upriver and still under contract with the company. And Glass was determined to reach him, and that's exactly what he did. When he finally gets enough strength, he moves upriver and looks for Bridger. And when he finally finds him, the boy didn't run. He stood there, frozen. He was barely 19, and he was stricken by guilt. He expected a bullet, but all he got was silence. Glass simply looked at him, nodded once, and walked away. Now, here's an interesting tidbit of information that I didn't realize at first. Is that young man Bridger? He actually ends up being the same guy that opens up Fort Bridger. The same place where some people think he gave the crew of the Donner Party some bad information and let them walk into their slow and agonizing deaths. Now, it's an episode I covered a little earlier on, but if you want to hear the full story of the Donner Party, it's on the channel. I suggest you check it out. It was one of the first survival episodes I think I ever covered on this channel. It's a great story, and it's kind of weird that this Bridger guy is involved in two of the most famous stories of wilderness survival that I know. But after confronting Bridger, he actually learns that Fitzgerald had gone on much further. He had gone to a place called Fort Atkinson, deep into Army territory, and enlisted with them. And by the time Glass arrived, half limping and barely recovered, Fitzgerald was wearing a government uniform. And unfortunately for Glass, that made him untouchable. The officers told Glass plainly, if you shoot him, you hang. So he didn't. He took back his rifle, the one Fitzgerald had carried off, and left. That was the end of it. After all the crawling, hypothermia, and hunger, there was no reckoning, only exhaustion. The man who'd come back from the dead didn't want blood anymore. He just wanted distance at this point. But for Hugh Glass, he wouldn't stay in these settlements very long. Once he decided that justice wasn't for him and he was strong enough, he picked up his rifle and he went back to what he knew, the wild. At the time, after going through this ordeal, there was no type of reward, no recognition, and no comfort for him. All he could do was return to the mountains, the rivers, and the traplines that he knew. By 1833, 10 years after the bear attack, he ends up being killed in another ambush, shot and scalped by the Arikara warriors along the Yellowstone River. At this time, there was no fanfare, no legacy carved in stone. He just became another man buried in the land that nobody would take notice of. But somehow this story would survive. And not necessarily right away, and not in the newspapers or official reports, but in campfire retellings and secondhand letters. It was passed from trapper to trader, from journal to frontier tale, and eventually, decades later, into books. But each time, the details would shift. Some would say that he crawled 80 miles, while others say 200. Some said he forgave the men who left him, while others would say that he planned to kill them both. There's no diary and no first-person account, just fragments filtered through time. The truth of Hugh Glass was likely simpler and harder. He was simply a man trying to survive, somebody that absolutely refused to die. And that's the part that stuck. Survival seems to be something that's based in somebody's resolve to live. Some people don't have it, I guess. I mean, I would like to think that I do, but it's hard to say. And how much of this story is actually true, I don't know. But I can tell you one thing, from talking to people who have ran trap lines out in the wilderness, this type of story wasn't uncommon for somebody to get hurt like this really bad in the wilderness, whether it be by a tree falling on them or a bear attack, and literally having to crawl 40, 50, maybe even 100 miles to get help. So it definitely seems to me that at least that part of the story is most likely true, because it wasn't something that just happened to Hugh Glass. Thanks again for tuning into this episode this week, and I'll be back again next week with another story. Maybe this one will have cannibals in it. See you then.